Hi, this is Professor Favors with American Literature. So we are discussing Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery. We are getting only two selections from the main text. And also, this is part of the turn of the 20th century in terms of the literary work. And then it is also connected to the growth of modernism. So this is American Literature, Booker T. Washington selections from Up from Slavery. This lecture is subject to fair use. And here's Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915. Born a slave in Virginia, Booker T. Washington grew up to become the most influential Black author and activist of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As discussed in his autobiography, Up from Slavery, Washington spent his early childhood working as a slave on a plantation. After emancipation and while still a boy, he first worked with his stepfather in the coal mines and salt foundries of West Virginia, and then as a houseboy. At the age of 14, Washington left home to attend the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, a segregated school for minorities, where he worked as a janitor while learning to be an educator. Washington distinguished himself at the Hampton Institute, ultimately returning after graduation at the invitation of the school's principal to teach there. In 1881, at the age of 25, Washington was hired to build and lead the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, now today as Tuskegee University, a new school in Alabama whose mission was to train African Americans for agricultural and industrial labor. The school was so poorly funded that Washington and his students famously had to make their own bricks and construct their own school buildings. Through Washington's inspiring leadership and tireless fundraising, Tuskegee grew and prospered. In 1895, Washington gave a 5-minute speech at the Atlanta Cotton State and International Exposition that propelled him to the forefront of American politics and culture. American presidents called on him for advice about race relations, and white business leaders sought him out to coordinate chari- charitable giving to black institutions, earning Washington the moniker the Moses of his race in newspapers of the era. So here's some quick information from the main text. So about selections from Up from Slavery. Two chapters from Washington's biography, Up from Slavery, are included here. In the first chapter, Washington recounts his childhood up until the time of emancipation. In the 14th chapter, he reprints his exposition address and discusses his startlingly positive reception by a largely white audience that up to that point was fearful of America's black population. Unlike contemporaries such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Washington did not criticize the Supreme Court's 1896 ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson that the nation's different races should be treated as separate but equal. Instead, he sought to work within the law's segregationist restrictions. Washington pragmatically wrote his biography to showcase the industry and integrity of all African Americans rather than to demonize his former owners or celebrate his personal accomplishments. As you read Washington's two chapters, consider how Washington uses the form of the slave narrative to give examples not only of the horrors of slavery, but also of harmonious and honorable race relations. So we do have some additions. I have changed the before and end date from 1816 to 1954. And we do have some additions in terms of historical implications. So let's go over the um, the previous ones and then look at or call attention to the new ones. So again, 1816, American Colonization Society proposed to free slaves and send them back to Africa to stop slavery, pre-abolitionist movement. So remember, these are historical implications that affect our reading, and the current reading is um, um, on Washington's experiences prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. So 1819, the Panic of 1819, which was our first peacetime financial crisis, Thomas Jefferson founds the University of Virginia. Then, of course, we have Maine and Missouri becoming states, Florida becoming a territory. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 allowed the state to become a slave state, so that affected race relations, of course. 1826, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams die on the same day. Now we have a new one. 1828, Jim Crow is created. That's the character Jim Crow. Thomas Dartmouth Rice, white actor performing blackface. So that's our new historical implication. And it informs the Jim Crow laws and era. 1829, Andrew Jackson becoming president. So then we have the anti-slavery sentiment where the abolitionist movement begins, Nat Turner's revolt, slavery debates. Of course, 1837, Oberlin College enrolling female students, Florida and Texas becoming states, and then the American Civil War begins. We have Fugitive Slave Act, Congress enacting the first Fugitive Slave Acts for refugee slaves date back to 1643. We also have the Dred Scott decision where slaves and blacks who descended from slaves were not considered American citizens and could not sue. So then let's look at all of the different factors that affected the American Civil War as well as the amendments that derived from it. So we know that the American Civil War is 1861 to 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed Southern slaves, the Reconstruction era, which began 1863 to 1877, and then 1865 is when President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in the same year. 14th Amendment grants citizenship and equal protection under the law. 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, part of Reconstruction, no racial discrimination in voting. And then the abolitionist movement basically ends here. So then we have from 1865 to 1913, industrial revolution changes, technological improvements, manufacturing, etc. And now we have here Jim Crow laws that enforce racial segregation in the South between the end of Reconstruction and beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. That's why we have the 1954 year here, because it actually ends Jim Crow law. So I thought it was very interesting when I was looking this up. The Separate Car Act, which means equal but separate accommodations, that it was at the same time of the founding of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It's 1890. And then we have Plessy v. Um, Ferguson decision, which assessed the separate but equal doctrine to determine the constitutionality of racial segregation, and it reviewed the meaning behind the 14th Amendment. And we understand the 14th Amendment is granting citizenship and equal protection under the law. So don't forget, the Spanish American War doesn't necessarily directly apply to this historical implication for the text, but it is something to note that it was 2 years after one decision, separate but equal, we have a war, right, that's going on, and that's 18. And then we had prior to that the American Civil War. So it seems like we can't stay out of wars. In the 1920 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. So they formed the Suffrage Voting Association in 1890, but didn't get the right to vote until 1920. And then black women did not get the right to vote until way much later. And so then Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, U.S. Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is unconstitutional, whereas here it is constitutional. So keep these ideas in mind. So we need to review some post-Civil War laws, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which actually applied to seceded states only. So let's look at recap and new. So we have something that is kind of bringing forward the previous discussion on historical implications so we can see what's actually new. So again, American Civil War between Union and Confederacy, which are your Southern secessionist states. Emancipation Proclamation, all persons held as slaves within the rebellion states are free. Reconstruction era includes legal, social, political challenges of the abolition of slavery, reintegration of the 11 former Confederate states into the United States, okay, into the Union. Assassination of Lincoln, 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment granting citizenship, equal protection under the law, 15th Amendment giving black men the right to vote, and then the abolitionist movement technically ends here. As it ends, 7 years later, Jim Crow laws are beginning. Okay, some aspect of it was already beginning, but it's the segregation aspect of it, the codification of the law was starting to begin in 1877. So let's review case law: Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, and Separate Car Act, 1890. So Plessy v. Ferguson, the origination date is 1892, and it was to challenge the Separate Car Act of 1890. And there is a decision date on this for 1896. So the purpose was to assess the constitutionality of racial segregation, referring to the doctrine separate but equal. So separate quarters but equal in terms of value. So don't forget that there are key laws that um, the court case tends to reference. So that's your 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and then your 14th Amendment, which grants equal protection of the laws and citizenship. So Separate Car Act 1890 required that railroads operating in the state provide equal but separate accommodations for white and African American passengers, prohibited passengers from entering accommodations on the basis of race. Law does not apply to interstate travel. So within a particular state, intrastate, uh, the Separate Car Act applies, but it does not apply between states or interstate. So there's a test case using Plessy, and I go over that in the next slide. Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Law, which was in 1891 when they formed. All right, so the test case was a group of Creole professionals in New Orleans formed the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Law, hiring Albion Torgy, a Reconstruction era judge and social reformer, as legal counsel. The committee chose a person of mixed race, Homer Plessy, who was 7/8 white, 1/8 African American, to argue that the law could not be consistently applied to the failure of the due to the failure to define white and colored races. Plessy purchased a rail ticket for travel in Louisiana, the state, took a seat in a car designated for white passengers, refused to move to a car for African American passengers, was arrested and charged with violating the Separate Car Act, and argued that the act was unconstitutional, citing the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. U.S. District Court Judge John H. Ferguson dismissed Plessy's argument. Louisiana State Supreme Court affirmed the district court's ruling. The U.S. Supreme Court granted Plessy the right to oral arguments on April 13, 1896. The court rendered a decision in 1896, May. So we're going to look at two types of opinions. One is a majority opinion, and the other is a dissenting opinion. So from Associate Justice Henry Billings Brown. First opinion: Judge Brown rejected Plessy's argument that the act violated the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibited slavery. So he's saying that his argument that his rights um, to not be separate and still have equal accommodations is a violation of the 13th Amendment. Judge Brown rejected Plessy's argument that the act violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which granted full and equal rights of citizenship to African Americans. And then opinion number 3, the 13th Amendment, Brown suggests, did not conflict with the Separate Car Act because the Separate Car Act law does not reestablish slavery or constitute a badge of slavery or servitude. Opinion number 4, Judge cited Supreme Court's rulings in civil rights cases 1883, which outlined that racial discrimination against African Americans in inns, public conveyances, and public places of public amusement does not impose a badge of slavery or involuntary servitude. Instead, it infringes rights protected from state aggression by the 14th Amendment. And then the last opinion, the 14th Amendment does not conflict with the Separate Car Act because the 14th Amendment secures legal equality, not social equality. Keep that in mind. It secures legal equality, not social equality. And so that the accommodations were equal and racial segregation did not imply legal inferiority. So by default, it implies social inferiority. The Separate Car Act preserves public peace and good in order. So essentially, you stay on your side, we stay on our side, and we will have good peace, public peace and good order. So here is uh, um, the dissenting opinion from Associate Justice John Marshall Harlan. So his opinion number 1, the court ignored the obvious purpose of the Separate Car Act, which was to exclude colored people from coaches occupied by or assigned to white persons and not exclude white persons from railroad cars occupied by blacks. So the whole thing, the whole Separate Car Act is really applied to blacks, not to whites. Opinion number 2, it is important to compel colored persons to keep to themselves while traveling in railroad passenger coaches. And then the statute interferes with the personal freedom of citizens, particularly the personal liberty and freedom of movement of both African Americans and whites. So even though he's outlining that the Separate Car Act has a particular purpose to keep whites and blacks segregated, separate, and the rule really applies to blacks primarily. But in his opinion, that this particular Separate Car Act still infringes on the personal freedom of citizens just in general, their personal liberty and their freedom of movement. And he's suggesting that our Constitution is colorblind, or it should be colorblind, and that all citizens are equal before the law. The judgment this day rendered will, in time, prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case, which declared that African Americans were not entitled to rights of citizenship. So his dissenting opinion is essentially, um, I'm not sure that he has a problem with Separate Car Act, just in general. I think he's looking at the ideal that everyone is entitled to personal freedom of citizens. Sometimes you can disagree and have a different opinion, but not necessarily have a problem per se with segregation. But he doesn't necessarily say that either. So let's review Jim Crow laws, segregation of whites and persons of color. And here is your Thomas Dartmouth Rice, born 1808 to 1860. So and your Jim Crow laws are technically begin 1877 and end in the 1950s. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation in the South between the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Jim Crow was the name of a minstrel routine performed in the beginning in 1828 by Thomas Dartmouth, Daddy Rice, to imitate African Americans in segregated life. And so his stage persona was actually Jim Crow. It is based upon a particular name, and he wore blackface. So let's look at origins, Jim Crow law origins. prior to the American Civil War, because slaves were perceived as inferior in status, there wasn't a need to establish laws segregating them from white people. Provided slaves recognized their subordinate place, both races could work side by side. Although some form of segregation existed before 1860, there was no uniform pattern to segregation. So did not, some states ignore the law between blacks and whites. Instead, some southern states were not unified in how they would apply segregation because there was no real system of public education prior to the war. So some states were fully integrated until 1877. North Carolina saw former slaves and whites sit next to each other in jury pools. Texas required every train to have one car for people of color. So there was no uniform pattern. Jim Crow law creates a uniform pattern. So in 1877, the Supreme Court ruled in Hall v. Decour that states could not prohibit segregation on common carriers, such as railroads, streetcars, or riverboats. The civil rights cases of 1883 overturned key elements of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, sanctioning the notion of separate but equal without using the term. So now we are moving into this understanding of a uniform pattern to segregation. So here are your solutions to the problems of race relations, and it's basically problems of race relations on the side of white people not wanting to be near be near black people, but that's only because it is a retaliatory move due to the abolition of slavery. So solution number one: Louisville and New Orleans and Texas Railway v. Mississippi required segregation on intrastate carriers, so we're still within the state. From 1887 to 1892, 9 states passed laws requiring separation on streetcars and railroads, required equal accommodations for black passengers, imposed fines and jail terms for railroad employees. 5 states provided criminal fines or imprisonment for passengers sitting in cars where their race was excluded. And then solution number 3, Louisiana Separate Car Act, which promote the comfort of passengers, provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. However, this law marked a humiliating reversal of fortune for black and mixed race citizens who enjoyed a more tolerant attitude and autonomy from the slave state toward people of color. That's your slave state, the state of Louisiana. From toward people of color, Creoles, who were part of a third class, freed descendants of European fathers and African mothers, who could marry, testify in court against whites, and inherit property from their fathers. So, because of this Separate Car Act to support Jim Crow laws, these people here, Creoles, who initially enjoyed a more tolerant attitude, were now subject to this particular law, Louisiana Separate Car Act, 1890. Southern state legislatures passed Jim Crow laws, and they passed it based upon this idea of any ascertainable or strongly suspected of a person having black ancestry, a person of color. Separation of whites from persons of color in public transportation, schools, parks, cemeteries, theaters, restaurants. This prevents contact between blacks and whites. Jim Crow laws were codified by the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal doctrine. So let's return to the not only the test case, but all of the factors leading up to the creation of the committee. So the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act question. So they based their case when responding to Jim Crow laws on 2 questions. How did the law or train conductor determine the race of a passenger? And the determination of race was a complex question of both science and law. This issue could not be delegated to a trained individual, a trained official. So there's a case, Louisiana X Rail Abbott v. Hicks. So a train conductor. on the Texas and Pacific Railway was prosecuted for seating a black passenger in a white car that was traveling between two states. So that's your interstate. The case argued that Louisiana law did not apply to interstate travel, or if it did, it was unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause. Louisiana court agreed that regulations under the Separate Car Act did not apply to interstate passengers. The committee used Homer Plessy, a light skinned shoemaker, to test the law. So once this law passed here, referring to interstate, not intrastate, but interstate passengers, then the committee went with Homer Plessy to see if it could test the law based upon his race. So we're using Plessy now to test the separate car law for interstate. So on June 7th, 1892, Homer Plessy purchased a first class ticket to Covington in the Press Street Depot in New Orleans. He boarded the East Louisiana Railroad's number 8 train. The train conductor asked him if he was a colored man, to which Plessy replied yes. The train conductor asked him to move to the colored car, and Plessy refused by saying, I am an American citizen. I have paid for a first class ticket and intend to ride to Covington in the first class car. The train conductor stopped the train and had him arrested and forcibly dragged by a detective and with the help of other passengers. Plessy spent a night in jail and answered charges the next day before a criminal court judge. He was accused of violating the Separate Car Act. Plessy failed in court, and the Supreme Court solidified the establishment of the Jim Crow era, 1896. So let's recap Jim Crow laws timeline. Remember 1828, Thomas Dartmouth Rice creates the minstrel character, Jim Crow, stereotype black characters. He's a white man wearing blackface. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The case Hall v. DeCour rules that states cannot prohibit segregation on carriers. So that means segregation still reigns. 1883, the Supreme Court declares the Civil Rights Acts of 1875 unconstitutional, which sanctions separate but equal. The Louisiana Separate Car Act requires equal but separate accommodations. On May 18th, Supreme Court upholds the Separate Car Act in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, solidifying Jim Crow. 1896 to 1950s, Jim Crow laws expand to segregation in schools, businesses, sports, churches, hospitals, all ways of life. 1950, Supreme Court rules in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka that separate but equal is unconstitutional. So then, now that it is considered unconstitutional, it's ending the Jim Crow era. So Congress from 1964 to 1968 passes particular laws: Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, and then you have the Loving v. Virginia 1967. Miscegenation laws are considered unconstitutional. So people who are people can marry interracially. All right, so let's recap historical and literary periods today. Not going to be too long, but there's your American Civil War, of course, your Spanish War, and then Romanticism, Realism, and Naturalism influences on the turn of the 20th century writing. So here's your timeline of the American Civil War, just to kind of jot your memory, because the literary work by Booker T. Washington references the war, references also Emancipation Proclamation. So the North and South were divided over the issue of slavery. The Southern plantation agricultural economy depended on slaves, while the Northern economy depended on manufacturing. By the 1850s, abolitionism was growing in the North, and the southern states believed the government would end slavery. The southern states believed the government did not have the right to end slavery. So even though we can have in one area of the country abolitionism, people pushing for the abolition of slavery, we can have another place, another geography, and demographic of people who still want to keep slavery. Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States, winning the 1860 presidential election. Lincoln's election led to 11 states seceding from the Union over the issue of slavery, forming the Confederate States of America. Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, 1861. By 1862, Lincoln called on the seceded states to rejoin the Union or have their slaves declared free. 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The South was devastated by the war. Union preserved. 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution ratified. Reconstruction took place 1865, between 1865 and 1877. These events represent the historical context before selections from up from slavery. So here's the results of the Spanish-American War, which was 1898. Just a brief recap. So Cuba received independence. Spain seceded control of Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States. Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for 20 million. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty on February 6, 1899. Hawaiian planters and businessmen sought annexation, but President Grover Cleveland rejected the request. On appeal to consider Hawaii as vital to the U.S. economy, serve as a strategic base to protect U.S. interests in Asia, and to prevent other nations from taking over the islands, Hawaii instead became a U.S. territory in 1898. So do keep in mind that these are events. These events represent the historical context before selections from up from slavery, which was published in 1901. Don't forget the differences between romantic writing and realism writing. So one is about the fantastical, the heroic, the other is about real, accurate imitation of life. So even though Booker T. Washington's work is more about the turn of the 20th century, you still have and is leaving off the fiction. So realism writing is accurate imitation of life as it is truth in fiction, removing now into nonfiction. So we understand that this is the historical, this is the heroic, which is fictional writing, and this is also fictional writing, and we're moving out of that. And so even though we understand realism is fictional writing, it's still influenced by the American Civil War, which is a truth in fiction, and that it depicts the human cost of the Civil War, American Civil War. Don't forget naturalism, which rejected romanticism. It rejected realism because of its limitations in terms of subject matter. For the naturalist, the realist did not want to offend the sensibilities of its readers. And so you see, Booker T. Washington is not a naturalist writer. His experiences are non-fictional, but he is revealing some aspects of human life in his writing. And then don't forget that the naturalist is the pessimistic, materialistic determinism, where a benevolent deity or any supernatural form is absent, and idealistic concepts such as justice, liberty, innate goodness, morality are shown as illusions. However, in contrast to Booker T. Washington, I don't know if he's necessarily pushing for justice, but he is pushing for education, and he's not worried so much about trying to gain voting rights as W.E.B. Du Bois is. So then, naturalism is a journalistic perspective with narrative distance on the character's degeneration. This is in contrast to Booker T. Washington, where he's referring to himself. He's telling his own slave narrative. So there is no narrative distance. And then quickly introducing the turn of the 20th century, the rise of the immigrant. Okay, so another northern and southern migration. In the United States, the northern and western migration that followed Reconstruction, which was the period between 1865 and 1877, when the federal government set the conditions by which the states of the former Confederacy would be readmitted to full participation in the national government, caused such rapid growth in northern cities that the municipal governments were strained to the breaking point as they rushed to deliver services to millions of residents in thousands of languages. In the West, waves of migration were rapidly filling in the plains and prairies. This population boom set up a clash of cultures that continues to have repercussions in contemporary politics. In less than 20 years, the United States marked two population milestones: population of New York City exceeding 5 million persons for the first time, and in 1915, the total population of the United States topped 100 million. So this is really no northern and western migration. So I said earlier about southern migration. Many immigrants to the United States in this period were fleeing from the collapse of the ancient European monarchies and empires. The dawn of the 20th century witnessed the first significant crisis of American identity since the end of the Civil War, because now we have more of an immigrant community. It witnessed also the rise of the African American literary culture and fascination with the West. So now that we have already gone over the historical context, the legal context, Emancipation Proclamation, Plessy v. Ferguson, Jim Crow laws, now you have an understanding of what's going on in the immediate text. The immediate text being selections from Up From Slavery, and it's actually Up From Slavery as the main text. So this is man's problem with freedom and responsibility. That's how I sort of observe it. All right, so pre-freedom, freedom. You need to um, have your work with you, your literary source in front of you if necessary. So I was born a slave on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. I'm not quite sure of the exact place or exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. As nearly as I have been able to learn, I was born near a crossroads post office called Hales Ford, and the year was 1858 or 1859. I do not know the month or the day. The earliest impressions I can now recall are of the plantation and the slave quarters, the latter being the part of the plantation where the slaves had their cabins. My life had its beginning in the midst of the most miserable, desolate, and discouraging surroundings. This was so, however, not because my owners were especially cruel, for they were not, as compared with many others. I was born in a typical log cabin, about 14 by 16 feet square. In this cabin, I lived with my mother and a brother and sister till after the Civil War, when we were all declared free. So he's speaking in first person. This is how you know that there's this move in terms of literary writing from fiction to nonfiction. These are all his experiences. This means that his work up from slavery is a primary source. At any time that we talk about his work, we are secondary sources, or any scholar writing about his work consider that person or scholars as secondary source materials. So when you quote from a person like Washington, you're quoting from him because he's giving you his particular experiences. So perception of victimhood, victim of institution, you'll see in the writing in a literary work that he refers to slavery as institution or victim of slavery, right? Of my ancestry, I know almost nothing. In the slave quarters and even later, I heard whispered conversations among the colored people of the tortures which the slaves, including no doubt my ancestors on my mother's side, suffered in the Middle Passage of the slave ship while being conveyed from Africa to America. I have been unsuccessful in securing any information that would throw any accurate light upon the history of my family beyond my mother. She, I remember, had a half brother and a half sister. In the days of slavery, not very much attention was given to family history and family records, that is, black family records, my mother, I suppose, attracted the attention of a purchaser who was afterward my owner and hers. And there's a lot more information that goes after that. Of my father, I know even less than of my mother. I do not even know his name. I have heard reports to the effect that he was a white man who lived on one of the nearby plantations. Whoever he was, I never heard of his taking the least interest in me or providing in any way for my rearing, but I do find a special fault with him. But I do not find a special fault with him. He was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution. So even as a white man, he's considered um, a victim of the institution of slavery, which the nation unhappily had engrafted upon it at that time. So there are your masters, and then there are your slaves, and then there are white men, because he doesn't necessarily call him a master. He called him a father. He calls him a white man, and who lived on one of the nearby plantations. But we don't know if that white man is a master. Not every white man during that time was a slave master. So so we have to wonder if he was just a regular white man, and if he was just a regular white man, then he was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution of slavery. However, if he was a master, he wouldn't necessarily be considered a victim. All right, perception of victimhood, victim of slavery. So the early years of my life, which were spent in the little cabin, were not very different from those of thousands of other slaves. My mother, of course, had little time in which to give attention to the training of her children during the day. She snatched a few moments for our care in the early morning before her work began, and at night after the day's work was done. One of my earliest recollections is that of my mother cooking a chicken late at night and awakening her children for the purpose of feeding them. How or where she got it, I do not know. I presume, however, it was procured from our owner's farm. Some people may call this theft. If such a thing were to happen now, I should condemn it as theft myself. But taking place at the time it did, and for the reason that it did, no one could ever make me believe that my mother was guilty of thieving. She was simply a victim of the system of slavery. So the previous person is a victim of the institution of slavery. She's a victim of the system. So the institution of slavery is hierarchical, where the system where you have the system could be applied to different plantations, which then makes it systematic. I cannot remember having slept in a bed until after our family was declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. So every time you see a reference to any type of historical event, you always want to research that information. So the occupation of slavery, I was asked not long ago to tell something about the sports and pastimes that I engaged in during my youth. Until that question was asked, it had never occurred to me that there was no period of my life that was devoted to play. From that time that I can remember anything, almost every day of my life has been occupied in some kind of labor. Though I think I would now be a more useful man if I had had time for sports. I put occupation because it's ironic. They're not actually um, people who hold occupations, right? Occupations will come above slavery. During the period that I spent in slavery, I was not large enough to be of much service. Still, I was occupied most of the time in cleaning the yards, carrying water to the men in the fields, or going to the mill, to which I used to take the corn once a week to be ground. The mill was about 3 miles from the plantation. This work I always dreaded. So he's talking about work. And after this, there's a lot. He's really talking about the distance he has to take um, in order to carry out the task. I'm not quite sure if he's actually complaining about this particular work itself, but if you read after this paragraph, he's really talking about the distance that he has to take. So the occupation of slavery. Issue of slavery. So during the campaign, which Lincoln was first the candidate for the presidency, the slaves on our far off plantation, miles from any railroad or large city or daily newspaper, knew what the issues involved were. It's interesting that he's mentioning railroad, and later there's going to be the Separate Car Act. When war was begun between the North and the South, every slave on our plantation felt and knew that though other issues were discussed, the primal one was that of slavery. So slavery and the fighting because of slavery, the war because of slavery, puts the whole nation in a chokehold. Who's going to win the war? Who's going to win the fight, the North or the South? Even the most ignorant members of my race on the remote plantations felt in their hearts with a certainty that admitted of no doubt that the freedom of the slaves would be the one great result of the war if the Northern armies conquered. Every success of the Federal armies and every defeat of the Confederate forces was watched with keenness and most intense interest. Often the slaves got knowledge of the results of great battles before the white people received it. This news was usually gotten from a colored man who was sent to the post office for the mail. And here, right before you get to the next line, he would stand by and watch, stand by and hear white people talk about it. The mail carrier on his way back to our master's house would as naturally retell the news that he had secured among the slaves, and in this way they often heard of important events before the white people at the big house, as the master's house was called. So here it is, the issue of slavery is having everyone in a chokehold. If you put yourself back in that mindset, maybe think about a particular film that is going on at this time. I think Lincoln was a film by Daniel Day-Lewis, who was the actor. And here it is, you have all these people who are deciding uh, the case of the issue of slavery. And so we have the North, and these people are kind of like in a chokehold, and then you have the South, and who's going to win the war? All right, the differences in deprivation. Naturally, much of the conversation of the white people turned upon the subject of freedom and the war, and I absorbed a good deal of it. So you have some people who are concerned about slavery. Then you have some people who are concerned about freedom and the war. Of course, as the war was prolonged, the white people in many cases often found it difficult to secure food for themselves. I think the slaves felt the deprivation less than the whites because the usual diet for the slaves was corn, bread, and pork, and these could be raised on the plantation. But coffee, tea, sugar, and other articles which the whites had been accustomed to use could not be raised on the plantation. And the conditions brought about the war frequently made it impossible to secure these things. The whites were often in great straits. Parched corn was used for coffee, and a kind of black molasses was used instead of sugar. Many times, nothing was used to sweeten the so-called tea and coffee. So the tea, coffee, and sugar were likely imported, and so these are the conveniences that whites got used to. And so when they couldn't raise it, raise it on a plantation, it's deprivation for them. Whereas blacks or slaves got used to not having or always been deprived or something, and they just learned how to work with the current conditions of the day. The issue of sympathy. So one may get the idea from what I have said that there was a bitter feeling toward the white people on the part of my race because of the fact that most of the white population was away fighting in a war which would result in keeping the Negro in slavery if the South was successful. In the case of the slaves on our place, this was not true, and it was not true of any large portion of the slave population in the South where the Negro was treated with anything um, like decency. During the Civil War, one of my young masters was killed and two were severely wounded. I recall the feeling of sorrow which existed among the slaves when they heard of the death of Master Billy, Mars Billy. It was no sham sorrow, but real. Some of the slaves had nursed Marsabili. Others had played with him when he was a child. Marsabili had begged for mercy in the case of others when the overseer or master was thrashing him. The sorrow in the slave quarter was only second to that in the big house. Some of them, when the two young masters were brought home wounded, the sympathy of the slaves was shown in many ways. They were just as anxious to assist in the nursing as the family relatives of the wounded. The slaves would even beg for the privilege of sitting up at night to nurse their wounded master. So even though he's Washington is telling you that as slaves who are about to become free, we're not bitter toward the white people. We actually understand the system of slavery, or the institution of slavery, and how we're all sort of victims of it. And so, to show you that we are not bitter, some of the masters who came back severely wounded, uh, the slaves of that master would tend to him. So that's your issue of sympathy, because here it is. The sympathy should be more for the slave in this regard, but I think that the slaves have been so conditioned to support their master, even if they are on the brink of freedom. All right, the differences in dependency. So as a result, as a rule, not only did the members of my race entertain no feelings of bitterness against the whites before and during the war, but there are many instances of Negroes tenderly caring for their former masters and mistresses who, for some reason, have become poor and dependent since the war. I know of instances where the former masters of slaves have for years been supplied with money by their former slaves to keep them from suffering. I have known of still other cases in which the former slaves have assisted in the education of the descendants of their former owners. So, interestingly enough, the former slaves are not only tending to their wounded masters, but they have also giving them some money. They have also assisted in the education of their descendants. And we're going to see why. I know of a case on a large plantation in the South in which a young white man, the son of the former owner of the state, has become so reduced in purse and self control by reason of drink that he is a pitiable creature. And yet, notwithstanding the poverty of the colored people themselves on this plantation, they have for years supplied this young man with the necessities of life. One sends him a little coffee or sugar, another a little meat, and so on. So here it is. So it's interesting how the slave owner, um, uh, the slave owner and the master, who can be one and the same, did not plan for freedom. Did not plan for the slave's freedom, because if they did, they would have prepared for the necessities of life. Why would you need money from your former slave? Why would you need education from your former slave? Why is there now so much dependency when the slaves had to depend upon you, but in a bad way? So I just thought that was kind of interesting. The effects of work and lack of work. So now we're going to see why. So ever since I have been old enough to think for myself, I have entertained the idea that, notwithstanding the cruel wrongs inflicted upon us, the black man got nearly as much out of slavery as the white man did. Now, take a pause, because now you're going to see why. Because he's not necessarily advocating for slavery, but he's telling you that because there was work on the part of the slave and lack of work on the part of the master, that the slave got more out of slavery than the white man. The hurtful influences of the institution were not by any means confined to the Negro. This was fully illustrated by the life upon our own plantation. The whole machinery of slavery was so constructed as to cause labor, as a rule, to be looked upon as a badge of degradation, of inferiority. So the slaves are forced to work, but it's not necessarily called work, it's really slave work. And the masters do not work because the slaves are working. But they both see it looks like they both see work in the way that they have to work or not work as inferior. So hence, labor was something that both races on the plantation sought to escape. The slave system on our place, in a large measure, took the spirit of self-reliance and self-help out of the white people. My old master had many boys and girls, but not one, so far as I know, ever mastered a single trade or special line of productive industry. The girls were not taught to cook, sew, or to take care of the house. All of this was left to the slaves. When freedom came, the slaves were almost as well fitted to begin life anew as the master, except in the matter of book learning and ownership of property. So slaves did not own property. There was they were sort of prohibited from book learning. The slave owner and his sons had mastered no special industry. They they unconsciously had imbibed the feeling that manual labor was not the proper thing for them. On the other hand, the slaves in many cases had mastered some handicraft, and none were ashamed, and few unwilling to labor. So here's my note here. You're considered inferior if you work. That's what that kind of means here. I'm not quite sure if it just truly applies, but it's interesting that the slave owner and his sons had mastered no special industry. So they're thinking that overseeing slaves was work, but they didn't put their hands to anything to develop a skill. All right, the possession of freedom. So, the most distinct thing that I now recall in connection with the scene was that some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation, I think. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. And there's a lot of information that comes after that. For some minutes, there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy. But there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. The wild rejoicing on the part of the emancipated colored people lasted but for a brief period, for I noticed by the time they returned to their cabins, there was a change in their feelings. The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children seemed to take possession of them. Pay attention to that. They were possessed in slavery as slaves, but now they have to take uh, possession of themselves in freedom. So these were the questions of the home. Now you got to think about how you're going to create a home for yourself because you don't own any property. How you're going to create a living for yourself because your occupation in quotation marks was a slave. How you're going to rear your children now. What kind of education, citizenship, establishment, and support of churches. Was it any wonder that within a few hours the wild rejoicing ceased and a feeling of deep gloom seemed to pervade the slave quarters? See, a lot of times people want to be free. Just adding a modern take to this, a lot of times people want to be free and they will rejoice at freedom, but they don't realize the responsibility that comes with freedom. It's the same concept as you want to leave out of your parents' house, okay, but you don't understand what that really means to live on your own, take care of yourself, keep a job, pay your own bills, etc. And remember, during this time, they did not own property. They could not go and put in an application for a job so quickly. They're coming from the bottom. That's why the title of the work is Up from Slavery. They're coming from the bottom. So that means, where do you go? Where do you live? It's not like you can go and put in an application at an apartment building, right? Or or at a job. And many of the jobs were really in the North because the North was concerned about the abolition of slavery, and they were moving forward into manufacturing. So if you can make it to the North, then you could at least become an apprentice. But of course, you need money to do that. All right, so understanding the nature of the leap. So, our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands and fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor, and put brains and skill into the common occupations of life, shall prosper in proportion as we learn to draw the line between the superficial and the substantial, the ornamental gewgaws of life and the useful. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as it is in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life we must begin, and not at the top. Nor should we permit our grievances to overshadow our opportunities. And I've actually read the full text up from slavery. I did prior to the semester starting, and um, there's a lot going on here where he's pushing for black people to get a trade, go to the agriculture school, the Tuskegee University, um, to do that. Whereas with Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, he was trying to push for social justice, voting rights, things like that. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. Slavery does not necessarily prepare you for privileges. When you do not have privileges, as in freedom, you're not prepared for it. Now you prepare yourself in however way you work as a slave, what you do as a slave, uh, the limited knowledge you have. But as you become free, when you take this leap from slavery to freedom, now you have to be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. All right, so that's the end of the presentation. These are the works, so you can find information about the 20th century, Booker T. Washington selections from Up from Slavery, the Britannical entry for Plessy v. Ferguson, Separate Car Act, Jim Crow Laws timeline, Emancipation Proclamation, and then entry for causes and effects of the American Civil War. Now, you don't necessarily have to use Britannica, but it's more of an edited. They have a um, editorial um, strict strict editorial policy, so you can find that, or history I think.com, or any of those types of websites. Resources, don't forget realism, naturalism, definition of realism and naturalism, Spanish American War, glossary of literary terms, and then point of view. And that's key, because when we're moving out of romanticism, realism, and naturalism into the turn of the modern century, we're moving from um, fiction type works to now nonfiction type works. All right, so here are some Booker T. Washington resources. You have the Britannica entry, American Educator. You have the Tuskegee University biography, and then a bibliography um, of Booker T. Washington. All right, so this is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.